Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou I tēnei rā. Kei te hari taku nākau ki te kiti a koutou I tēnei rā. Ko wai au, ko au te uri o te kapotai, nā puhi te iwi, mahuhu ki te rangi te waka, waikare te awa, kapo ai te maunga, waikare te tūranga waiwai, ko Lily George Taka Whenua, no waikare ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, thank you for being here today. And thank you to Kani for the invitation to present at this symposium. Ngā mihi aroa ki a koe. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces as well as meeting new people. That's always a wonderful thing to do. And it's definitely a privilege to be here with you today to share some of the insights I've gained over around 25 years as a researcher. I was trained initially as an anthropologist, and for some that might seem an ethical issue in itself. But I believe that anthropology and Kaupapa Māori and other methodologies I use, such as community-based participatory research, fit together well because relationships are important to the processes of research for such paradigms. And because I am a Māori woman, who I am as a cultural being has a fundamental influence on how I perceive the world and analyse it. As an Indigenous anthropologist, my intellectual tūranga waiwai draws from tūpuna, that of te ao Māori and anthropology. But claiming to be an Indigenous anthropologist, there that goes, assumes a certain history of experience, usually that of the negative effects of colonisation on Indigenous groups. It is a political as well as a cultural and historical positioning, but it is also about acknowledging the strengths and the beauties of our histories, of our ancestors, in order to build and create and innovate. But as an Indigenous anthropologist, I cannot escape the obligations of the responsibilities of research with my own people, that is Māori of Aotearoa, or more particularly Māori of Te Kapotai and Ngāpuhi and other peoples of Tai Tokerau. So being native can be seen as a positive factor when working with one's own people, and going native, that is being personally committed to the goals and aspirations of the community that you're working with, is often a necessary part of the rules of engagement in the construction of research that is a model for critical engagement with the world, rather than a distance and magisterial explanation of the world. So the work I do is mainly with Māori communities, is highly collaborative from design to dissemination, well actually from thought to design to dissemination, with a foundation of Kaupapa Māori research and with goals of transformation. So today I'm going to give a broad overview of the development of research ethics internationally and in Aotearoa, then give examples from some of the projects I've undertaken. And there were ethical dilemmas in each project, many ethical dilemmas in some. And I'll talk about a few of those, then draw out some principles of Indigenous and Māori research ethics that I use in my work. Now, apparently if I push the button, yes, great. Okay, so for too many years, Indigenous peoples have been the subjects and objects of research for Western researchers and academics. And sometimes they were not even scientists. So, for example, S. Percy Smith was a surveyor who in his work in Māori communities came to his own understandings of Māori culture and society, and he became a prolific contributor to 19th century understandings of the Māori. He and others of his time constructed what Angela Ballara called a grand design that fit the purposes of the emerging nation-state of New Zealand, conflating the unique and dynamic cultures of our iwi and hapu into one main form of Māori culture. So research was indeed often used as a tool of colonisation, perpetuating the intellectual arrogance of the newcomers that their knowledge and culture was superior to that of the natives in the new lands that they apparently discovered. And there's been a lot of history between now and then. But if we fast forward to 1999, And Linda Tuhiwai-Smith wrote that the word research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many Indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, conjures up bad memories, raises a smile that is knowing and mistrustful. And since the late 1960s, Indigenous and other marginalised people have been stirring up that silence on research that focused on our peoples as being in deficit, that reinforced negative stereotypes. We began protesting our lack of rights with regard to research and closed borders, in many instances, against non-Indigenous researchers, to the strident objections of many. But today, the legitimacy of Indigenous research methodologies and methods is recognised in many countries, although challenges remain, of course. And Indigenous researchers claim the right to develop and enact research ethics that is based on the premises and cultural mores from within which they research, including an emphasis on positive relationship development and maintenance. So important publications on Indigenous ethics, such as the South African-based SAN Code of Research Ethics, highlight the importance of respect, honesty, justice and fairness and care as important components of research with Indigenous peoples. And in Aotearoa, those such as Linda and Graham Smith, Sir Mason Dewey, Fiona Cram, Leonie Pihema, and others have developed what came to be known as Kaupapa Māori research. And I'll come back to this in a minute. But there is a whakapapa to the development of research ethics that is rooted somewhat in racism, which has been around for almost as long as humanity has been. For example, Aristotle had a theory of natural slavery whereby some people were naturally inferior and can therefore be properly enslaved by others. And this was used as a vindication for the maltreatment of Indians by conquistadors and later for the slave trade of Africans. Social Darwinism, with survival of the fittest theories, eugenics, and the rise of other scientific investigations added to such beliefs, which were to influence Western thought for several centuries. And the concept of eugenics was developed by the cousin of Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, in 1883, and was originally seen as a method of improving the human race, of course, for the purposes of the white races, and was particularly popular in the early 20th century. And many countries enacted various eugenic policies and programs which included genetic screening, birth control, marriage restrictions, segregation according to race or mental acuity, compulsory sterilisation and abortions, or forced pregnancies, and genocide. And such ideas enabled the forced confinement of those so-called inferior and degenerate races, such as Jews, with millions forced into concentration camps in Europe, many of whom were tortured, starved and killed. So the Nuremberg trials began in 1945 in Germany, bringing to justice military personnel involved in war crimes during World War II. But a positive outcome from the trials was the development in 1948 of the Nuremberg Code, which listed 10 ethical principles, including voluntary consent, avoidance of unnecessary suffering, injury and death, minimisation of harm, and the rights of participants to withdraw from any research project. And these form the basis of many of our research ethics today. But despite this, unethical research continues, and I'm sure continues today in some places. The infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment was conducted by the US Public Health Service between 1932 and 1972. And the uninformed and unconsenting participants were 600 African American men who thought they were receiving free healthcare, and they did, but really they were being experimented on. And of that 600, 399 already had syphilis, although they were not informed of the diagnosis or treated. And that became even more unethical in 1947 with the discovery of penicillin. as an effective treatment for syphilis, but doctors chose not to tell participants of the cure nor to treat them with it. And it was only in 1972, with increasing public outcry following media attention, that the experiment was finally stopped. And it wasn't until about 1992, I think, that the American government finally apologised for that. But African-American scholar Brandt connected the implementation of the Tuskegee study to Darwinism, which provided a new rationale for American racism. And he stated that, in retrospect, the study revealed more about the pathology of racism than it did about the pathology of syphilis, more about the nature of scientific inquiry than the nature of the disease process, and the degree of deception and damages have been seriously underestimated. As this history of the study suggests, the notion that science is a value-free discipline must be rejected. And here in New Zealand in 1987, the Commission of Inquiry was headed by Dame Sylvia Cartwright and investigated what became known as the unfortunate experiment, which many of you older ones will remember. But from 1966 to the early 1980s, Associate Professor Herb Green, I think it was at Auckland University, conducted a study of 948 women who had been diagnosed with cervical cancers. The study involved withholding treatment without their knowledge or consent from 131 of those women just to see what would happen. And Green's thesis was that untreated carcinoma in situ rarely, if at all, turned into full-blown cancer, but only 5% of the affected women had their cancer disappear without treatment. So women's health advocates Sandra Coney and Felida Bunkle wrote an expose in the 1987 issue of the Metro magazine about this unfortunate experiment, which led to the Cartwright inquiry. And the Commission did indeed find evidence of major medical malpractice, as uncovering other unethical practices such as conducting vaginal swabs on babies and using unconscious, uninformed, unconsenting women who were in surgeries for some other purpose, using them as guinea pigs for students to practice on. So as a result of the Cartwright inquiry, the Office of the Health and Disability Commissioner was set up with a Code of Health Consumers' Rights which strongly highlighted issues of informed consent. Health and disability ethics committees were established nationwide to deal with clinical and other health research. Teaching practices in hospitals were changed to meet international standards, and independent ethics committees were also set up in many institutions, including universities, throughout the country, but not without some controversy, as you will hear later. But one of the major publications regarding Māori research ethics is that of Te Ara Tika, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And we have one of the authors with us today, Tēnā koe, Paul. So today the legitimacy of... I've already done that bit. But as noted in Te Ara Tika, ethics is about values, and ethical behaviour reflects values held by people at large. For Māori, ethics is about tikanga, for tikanga reflects our values, our beliefs, and the way we view the world. And while we collapse a profusion of cultural groups under the term Indigenous peoples, the heterogeneity amongst Indigenous people must not be forgotten. And the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council maintains that in a research context, to ignore the reality of intercultural difference is to live with outdated notions of scientific investigation. It is also likely to hamper the conduct of research and limit the capacity of research to improve human development. Okay, so I was going to talk about Kaupapa Māori research, and then I realised it was kind of like, as the proverbial saying goes, teaching you how to suck eggs. So I'm not going to, and I'm just going to say that for my practice, creating and maintaining often lifelong relationships is paramount, or if the relationships already exist, doing what is needed to maintain those relationships. So for me, Kaupapa Māori research is people-centred research. which situates people within the context of the worlds in which they live and the relationships that they have. Our work is about people and the many facets of their lives and relationships with themselves and with others, including us as researchers, which is not to say that it's easy. As I'm sure you all know, there are many challenges to working with our own people, but the rewards are great. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about 4 of the projects I've been engaged in, starting with my doctoral research, which was with Awataha Marae community in Northcote on the North Shore, and it looked at how the embellishment of wharenui reflected changes in New Zealand society through 3 periods of Māori cultural renaissance. And these periods were about resistance to the impositions of another culture, reclamation of part of what had been lost through colonisation, and rejuvenation of people and culture. Awataha Marae arose in Renaissance Period 3 that began in the 1960s, and it also has connections to the efforts of Indigenous and other marginalised people worldwide in the endeavours to forge self-determining processes for themselves, and that included in developing methods of conducting research for our benefit and our purposes rather than those of others. And this was somewhat of an unusual project in that it was highly collaborative at a time when collaborative research wasn't common. Firstly, I was invited to do the research by influential kaumātua and queer in the Awataha community, Arnold and Rangitinia Wilson, and then spent most of the first year of the doctorate just talking with them at their home or at the marae and identifying the main themes of the project. And what they wanted me to do really was look at the history of the marae development so it wouldn't be lost, including factors such as the place of women and biculturalism. And because Arnold was an artist, he suggested I look at the embellishment of wharenui throughout those periods. But basically I collected stories, both historical and contemporary, which included my story as well as theirs, and the story we shared. Not long after my doctorate began, I became secretary, voluntold, as it's often said, secretary of the Awataha Marae Incorporated Society and education officer later on. And the historical stories related to significant figures in each Renaissance period. For example, Te Koti in the first period and Apirananata in the second. The third period featured Awataha Marae, of course, and Arnold and Rangitinia as the main figures of that history. So the history of Awataha is mostly told from their perspective, and that is both a limitation and a strength. So that it's limitation because it's mainly their story from their perspective, but a strength because of the depth to that story that I was able to uncover. But when I began the doctorate, Arnold suggested I had to return home to learn my own whakapapa so that I could bring that part of myself to the work with their community. Awataha was a pan-tribal urban marae where Māori from many tribes congregated, many of whom were disconnected culturally, finding Awataha a safe space in which to reconnect. So this particular project, and probably most of the projects I've been involved in, really reflect parts of my own journey of resistance, reclamation and rejuvenation as well. But there are also many challenges, and I hold the dubious honour of being the first student a complaint was laid against the Massey University Human Ethics Committee. And the fact that I was later a member then chair of that committee hopefully tells you that the complaint was not upheld. Okay, my postdoctoral project ran from 2011 to 2014, and I was fortunate to have Tikani as a supervisor on that. Thank you, Tikani. And we have, as I'm sure you all know, one of the highest rates of incarceration worldwide, and more than 60% of the female prison population is Māori. And Indigenous women across the globe actually have high rates of imprisonment, although Māori women are the highest. And one of the publications I've been involved in looks at the mass incarceration of Indigenous women and the reasons behind that. while it's undeniable that most of those people in New Zealand prisons are there because of a crime committed against individuals, groups and society, but that fact merely scratches the surface of some very complex issues. For Māori, this includes a history of colonisation, loss of resources, marginalisation in our own land, historical and contemporary trauma, poverty, underachievement in education and employment, and so on. And much of this adds up to what Sir Mason calls trapped lifestyles and subtle or overt confinement even before people get to prison. But this project arose because I was helping teach the first cohort of the postgraduate diploma of whānau ora at Massey University. And one of the students was a woman who had been to prison twice before and was now doing fantastic work with whānau in relation to methamphetamine addictions. In fact, she went to prison for a third time during the course and finished several assignments from prison. But this third stint was for charges that were mostly circumstantial and based on what she described as guilt by whakapapa. That is, her whānau was well known in the area for criminal activity, and in this case she was in the wrong place at the right time. And those charges were later dismissed, although more were created. Nevertheless, she helped me with project design, data collection and analysis, as did others in a mana wahine advisory group. So this group of women I worked with are not a community in the traditional sense, as they lived from Auckland to Kaitaia, but community is also both a feeling and a set of relationships among people with shared experiences and shared histories. And these women shared experiences of incarceration, colonisation, trauma, and trapped lifestyles, and that helped create their sense of community. And in fact, they all kind of knew each other from prison and afterwards. So the aims of the project included telling their stories, because they're often overlooked and dismissed, and to develop a program for incarcerated and post-incarceration for Māori women. And the reality is that the current programs don't work often enough, and the rates of reoffending are still too high, and often when our women and our men leave prison, there's little on the outside to encourage them to create better lives for themselves. And the narratives, certainly of the women I interviewed, exhibit many instances of suffering. For example, 90% have experienced sexual violence, and that's kind of across all the women in prison too. And none of this excuses their behaviour, but a measure of understanding and compassion can be gained from knowing these stories and the pathways that led to incarceration, including the wider societal and historical contexts within which those pathways were formed. And that understanding would not be complete without knowing the generations of trauma that have also contributed to current circumstances. So for many of our women who end up in prison, their potential remains unrealised, but we can use that potential to grow hope and encourage transformation. What is also required, however, is for all levels of society to look beyond stereotypes, to acknowledge, accept and support the development of potential within our wahine, and from that we can create narratives of hope. And in terms of intervention, Te Piringa Poho recognises the need for culturally sited healing in order to deal with trauma. It recognises untapped potential and sets in place strategies to realise it, thereby enabling transformation for whānau, for communities, as well as for individuals. Te Piringa Poho is also a network of people and agencies who can provide the kind of support that enables the women to thrive rather than just survive. And lying at the centre of this process is Te Hawairua that nurtures and supports these processes through spiritual sustenance. Okay, Northland unfortunately has a very high rate of suicide, as does our entire country, and Māori especially. In 2011 there were 5 youth suicides in Northland. In 2012 there were 19, too many of whom were Māori. And while there's been lots of work that's happened since then, in 2023 suicide is still the 4th leading cause of death for 15 to 29-year-olds. So still got a lot of work to do in ameliorating that. But in 2014, I became involved with the Ngāti Wai Education Unit, and they expressed the desire to do something about those rates because several of the rangatahi lost in 2012 were of Ngāti Wai descent. And that led to 3 rangatahi suicide prevention projects from 2014 to 2020, which were mostly marae-based and culturally grounded. The first was Hiara Toiora, which used art and drama to open spaces for conversations about suicide and other life stresses, because suicide is a symptom, of course, of other stuff that's going on. But at the whakawātea for the very first session, we talked to the rangatahi about the future program, and they told us, well, actually, that's really boring. And we want to do this, and we want to do that, and we want to do this. And we could have carried on and insisted that they do what we'd already planned, but instead we chose to let them have space and voice in that process. And I think that is a big reason for the success of the projects. The second project was Kokoritia Te Ora. And at the end of the first project, they identified themes of connection, healing and leadership as important to their growth. So given a space of safety from which to speak in which they knew they could be heard, the rangatahi were enabled to heal, connect and more strongly to culture and people and develop their leadership abilities. So in Kokoritia Te Ora, the rangatahi were community researchers who investigated those themes in various marae-based activities, as well as through experiences such as attending the inaugural World Indigenous Suicide Prevention Conference in Rotorua, I can't remember the year, that 2016, I think. I was so proud of them at that. They were amazing. And the third project was Kokoritia Te Aroha. So at the end of the second project, the rangatahi said they'd gained so much from the first 2 that they wanted to develop resources for other communities and other rangatahi. So we created an app named after the project, which you can get in the Play Store, as well as resource material for facilitators. Those rangatahi are mostly grown now, some have babies of their own, and most are leading productive and hopeful lives. And I recently received a message from one who now lives in Australia, but she joined Hiara Toiora after her best friend hung himself live on Facebook. But the day before she messaged me, she had just secured a job working in an Indigenous youth employment agency. And she considered that she could use most of the training that she received in all 3 projects in her new job, and she was really grateful for that. And I've certainly come a long way since 2014 in my own research practice, in being able to fully recognise that even rangatahi should have a voice in what you're doing, honouring the contribution of whoever it is that you're working with, honouring their expertise, because they are experts of their lives, you aren't, and enabling that collaboration to work together. So it is informing those initial ideas to design of the project and right through to dissemination and beyond often. While I knew the theories of collaborative and Kaupapa Māori research and had tried to practice those as much as possible, it wasn't really until this set of research projects with these amazing rangatahi that I really learned what it is to truly research with people. Okay, now, today, right now, this is our project. Tikani talked about the Waipareira way. Well, where I come from, we talk about the Waikari way. So, yes. So, Māori, like all our other health statistics, Māori have inequitable rates of various forms of arthritis. But they often go undiagnosed and our people just put up with the pain and other impacts on their daily lives. While the high prevalence of various forms of arthritis for Māori is known, and I actually believe it's underestimated, there's little research specifically regarding Māori lived experiences of joint pain. Yes. So Ponakaka is a collaboration between the Waikari Community Development and Research Trust, of which I am chair, and Public Health Northland, which I am also part of. primarily with the Intel team who helped design and deliver the project. But it was people from Waikato who determined the topic from recognising the impact joint pain was having on some of our own people. And the Trust secured a Ngā Kanohi Kitea Māori Community Research grant from the Health Research Council for this project, which goes until about June next year. And for those of you who don't know where Waikato is, it's literally in the bush between Kawako and Russell. A very isolated rural community with very few services, half an hour in either direction to the nearest shops over winding gravel, usually potholed roads. There are frequent floods and frequent power cuts. So being able to have a program that's based there that they can easily access has been amazing for them. And Waikato is also a beautiful place with a thriving kohanga reo kura iwi and marae. But yes, the primary aim of the project is to test the effectiveness of this marae-based holistic and kaupapa Māori intervention for Māori joint pain sufferers, for pain management and improved quality of life. And the secondary aim is to identify the importance of kaupapa Māori health interventions for Māori, particularly in relation to arthritis. And we know that they are really important, And we're also doing a regional survey, taitokero, of around 250 Māori with joint pain to just ascertain the impact of joint pain on their lives. So we meet at Waikato Marae on Mondays for 12 weeks, and we've just moved to fortnightly with the last two as monthly sessions. We use various forms of rongoa, including mirimiri or massage, foot care with our very own te kapotai podiatrist, gentle exercise, very good food that is teaching participants that eating well doesn't have to mean your food tastes like cardboard, and just the healing power of being together once a week, also to laugh, talk and play together. And this last point is really important and often not taken into account when programs are developed. Certainly the marae participants are very social and often very, very noisy, even during the exercise. But we also have 2 community nurses and a community wellbeing advisor from public health with us most weeks. They were supposed to only come maybe once a month, but they love it so much themselves they've decided they're going to come every time it's on. And the Intel team provides support, as I said, with the survey, but they also join us at the marae now and then too. And the participants really enjoy getting to know all the public health staff, which in turn helps dispel existing mistrust of health services. And we've also had staff from Sport Northland and the Diabetes Society. So there's this kind of organic process going on of creating a one-stop shop of sorts where participants can improve health and well-being while increasing their health literacy. What's my time like? Must be okay, I'll carry on. So the weekly sessions were initially for 12 weeks, but because of various factors like cyclones, because the HRC Assessing Committee suggested that a 3-month program would be sufficient. So we're testing that, but already we know that it's not. And I'm sure for other Māori that 3 months is not sufficient to create lasting change. So we'll be conducting interviews, though, with the participants at the end of this 12 weeks, and then again at the end of the program in December. And the feedback so far is really inspiring. Most note a significant decrease in pain for most of the following week. Many speak of their happiness at being there and being able to come to the marae for something other than a hui or a tangi or some big event they have to contribute to and instead are being given to. 4 of the 5 practitioners are connected to Waikato and Te Kapotai by whakapapa, and that's another important factor as well, while the other has worked with some of our whānau for a couple of years, so she's part of us anyway. But all 5 of those have noted how special the experience is for them too, and how this would be their dream jobs if they could do it full-time and across taitokere. So we're working on that. But all involved in the program express their joy at being there and are always disappointed when they can't come because of tangi or cyclones. It's some such thing. So there's huge potential there to develop an effective program that can make a real difference in the health and well-being of Māori with joint pain. And like I said, we're working on securing funding to take that program across Taitokoro. And while we're focusing on joint pain, there can be a positive impact on comorbidities such as obesity, type 2 diabetes and hypertension. But also breaking down that social isolation and providing positive touch for our kaumātua and queer who may rarely receive it otherwise, and that's just as important. They love their mirimiri, and in fact there was nearly a riot the other week because someone noticed that someone had rubbed their name off the board and inserted their own. So now we have to guard the board so no one can do that. But this project can also provide an effective framework for public health and working effectively with Māori communities. The health inequities for Māori are very well known, and with the current restructuring of the public health as well as health services generally, there's opportunity here to create something that is effective, truly effective, in dispelling inequities for Māori instead of repeating the same actions while expecting a different result. What would you rather hear about, ethical dilemmas or some principles? Because apparently I have 5 minutes. Okay, I'll go very quickly through these. Okay, so I'll just choose one from each. So when I was at Awataha Marae, not long after I'd started, I'd been asked to, I hadn't actually started the research with Awataha, I was challenged by other Māori at Massey University as to my right to do that, given that I didn't speak te reo Māori, nor knew much of tikanga. And that was near the beginning of the Kaupapa Māori research movement too, as part of our cultural renaissance. And one of the ways in which Māori researchers differentiated what we did from that of non-Māori was in terms of cultural connection. But unfortunately, an unintended consequence of that, I think, was the potential exclusion of those such as myself and others. And at this stage, I was just learning, just connecting. So initially I bought into those ideas of authenticity or my lack thereof, and I went to Arnold and I said to him, I'm really sorry, Arnold, but I don't think I can do this work with you, and I explained what had happened. And he simply smiled, looked at me and said, ko wai koe. And I remember then that I am an uri of Te Kapotai, a descendant of Rahiri and Ngāpuhi, and therefore connected to that whenua of Awataha, and that my whakapapa is inalienable. And he followed that up by asking, and who are they? But he didn't say it that politely. And that also taught me that how we as researchers, we need to honour the rangatiratanga of those in our communities that we work with. I was their choice, and they hadn't made that choice lightly, but even if they'd made a wrong choice, it was their right to choose. Okay. Kokoritia te aroha. I'll briefly go over that one. The rangatahi we worked with on these projects often came from backgrounds of poverty and lots of dysfunction in their households. Some had already experienced the criminal justice system, most had given up on education, and some had almost given up on life. So there was a need to be really sensitive to the nuances of behaviour that were enacted at the wānanga, and we endeavoured to have professional counsellors and so on along who could support this. And we had to develop a safety plan for that first project in particular, because it was the first time that a lot of these rangatahi were talking about suicide and other challenges they had, to ensure that if any of the rangatahi needed counselling or other support, they had relatively easy access to it. There were some really challenging moments though, and some very bad behaviour, but only one police call out, thank goodness. But one strategy we had to use was to address any behaviour immediately, rather than let it fester or pretend it didn't happen. Setting boundaries was very important, and the rangatahi developed a set of tikanga for our wānanga that they had to adhere to. But this also showed them that we were serious in our endeavour to support them, and that ultimately this was an exercise in aroha. As one of the project team said, you just got to love them. Okay, and finally, I just want to talk about some of the principles of Māori and Indigenous research ethics that I work by. Research driven by outside experts is no longer acceptable. Our communities are filled with people who may not have had formal tertiary education and degrees, but they're incredibly switched on and clever. And there are increasing numbers of those in our communities with degrees who come home to utilise their expertise with those who matter most, their own. Partnership, protection and participation are commonly known as principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and they are useful in this instance to illustrate that while we may not be able to transfer the methods of Kaupapa Māori research into other cultural contexts, these principles are transferable. That is, build relationships and partnerships with the people you're working with, share power and knowledge, protect their interests as well as your own and that of the organisation or institution that you're working for. I recall one of Ngāhui Te Awe Kotuku's principles of research with Māori, I think that was back in 1991, as when there's a challenge between the interests of the people and the organisational funder, the interests of the people are paramount. And enable participation from design to dissemination. One of the ways in which to do all three is honour the culture of the people you're working with, rather than trying to overlay or impose your own on them. Develop authentic relationships. Our whānau often demand these authentic partnerships and research that are locally relevant, community-based rather than community-placed. That is, listen to the voices and the needs of the community and work with them to develop projects based on their needs and to find solutions to those needs, rather than going with a pre-planned program or project that is merely placed within a community. Ko waikwe, research and know thyself. Personally, I don't believe in pure objectivity. I think it's a myth. Often this is seen as better than something that is subjective or within us, interpreted by us, and therefore less scientific. But everybody interprets everything according to their worldview, training, personality, experiences, and so on. And we as researchers bring our whakapapa, our culture, our history, our experience, and our training to how we do research. So I've often talked about notions of position subjectivity, which takes note of all of that, as well as the context within which you are researching, and understanding how that affects the way you position yourself and that within that context. So also know your triggers. What triggers you? You know, we often as Māori and researchers have our own traumas that we've grown up with, that we're dealing with. So know yourself enough that you know what's going to trigger you, and develop some strategies to deal with that. So you're not putting your own stuff onto the people that you're working with. And finally, every research locality has its own context, has its own needs, has its own ideas, and every group of people are experts in their own lives. So when you're a researcher, you have your own expertise and knowledge, you have your own experience, but that knowledge and experience is no more important than what the local people have. To me, the onus is on you as the researcher to find some way that your understanding, your knowledge, can be of service to those people. It's not just about your university degree or your paid job, it's about being of service. My grandfather, Pita Wiramuhori, taught me that purpose of life was to love and to be of service, and that service was itself an act of love. So it's about being of service ethically to whatever group of people you're working with, whether they're your own or someone else's. Tēnā koutou katoa. Any questions or comments? Kia ora, Ella.
Thank you, that was really wonderful. As a Māori researcher like you, one of the issues I'm finding increasingly, and I'm interested in the view of whoever here wants to have a kōrero about it, is how increasingly research funding, which pays for what we do, is targeting Māori knowledge, mātauranga, and is also founded on a notion of incorporating vision mātauranga in your funding proposals. But what I'm still finding in the university sector is a lot of tauiwi, non-Māori, are coming up with research projects and then bringing us in at the end or somewhere in the process, rather than using what you are presenting as an ethical model, which is Māori, forward and by Māori from the outset and community driven. And so I'm really interested in what whakaaro is about how we work collaboratively across research areas and institutions to protect our communities from this kind of 21st century form of intellectual colonisation, you know, like bring the Māori in at the last minute and put you in a junior role and go for big bucks, and how do we, what are some strategies that we might use to protect ourselves from what I see as a new form of colonisation?
To me it's kia ora. To me it's unacceptable. Just say no. No. It's not good enough. But yes, as Ella said, anyone else got any other comments?
Just a quick question. You skipped over a couple of ethical dilemmas. You put 2 out of the 4, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. What was the third one I was interested in?
Let's go back. Which one?
Yeah, kōkiritia te aroha.
Oh, that was the bad behaviour one. Yes, where we had to...
Are there any other, I guess, examples or, I guess, from that list there, ethical dilemmas that you encountered, especially how you overcame those?
So that with Ngāra Hau, you know, I'm talking with wahine who've engaged in some kind of criminal activity. And so I had to be really clear with them that I was there as a researcher. I wasn't part of the criminal justice system. And whatever they told me went no further, except, you know, my reports and my articles, but with their permission as well. So that had to be really clear about that. And I did hear a lot of, I did hear a lot. But that was also another, you know, like keeping everyone safe, I think, was really important with that, the participants as well as myself. So in terms, you know, they all agreed that I could use their real names in whatever publications came out of that. But after hearing these stories, I decided that was actually unethical because I realised that a prison sentence is actually a life sentence, that you can never escape it, that it always has some kind of impact on your life, even if you've done your time and it's over, because it's never really over in some ways. So I said to them instead, you know, would you allow me to choose a name, you know, a nom de plume for them? And they agreed with that. But the other thing was keeping myself safe. You know, I've had lots of experience in keeping myself spiritually safe in the kind of research that I do. But in this instance, because in some ways those stories were nothing I hadn't heard before, I didn't realise the full impact they were having on me. And it was actually the Pākehā transcriber who contacted me and said, you know, she's having to light candles and, you know, go in the water and cleanse herself after transcribing each interview because of the content of that. So it was a nice reminder for me about the necessity of keeping myself spiritually clean, so I don't carry their mamae as well as any of my own. Hector?
Saying, are we got time, Rewa, at the moment? I've got a question. How are we doing for time? We're doing good for time? Yep. 5 minutes, okay. I was just listening to you, Ella. Just wanted to respond. So, as Te Kani knows, you know, there's always been issues about non-Māori coming to Māori organisations or wanting to do research in their communities. And so part of the formation of the Wairangahau Ethics Committee was to actually help address that, to have a process in place where we can ensure that if people are coming to us, that they're going to be able to work with our communities in the right way. You know, and I just want to say, in terms of our ethics committee, everybody on there is handpicked. They might not believe it because a lot of it was part of it's voluntold, but you know, I think there's something in that term voluntold as well. What that says to me is, yeah, just do it. But part of it is also is that obviously
Respect.
you are trusted. There's somebody that you know and that you trust. So you know, while it might not feel like it, being voluntold is a compliment. But again, you know, with our ethics committee, you know, it was formed with the idea to make sure that we are able to participate in research, but that we can participate in the right way. And like I said, everybody in our committee, they're from the community, have worked in the community. They are passionate about a community, maybe too passionate, Te Kani. But, you know, we know they're the right people to be on that committee. And I have had some feedback from people who've gone through the Wairangaho Ethics Committee. And just so you know, the feedback has been, that's one of the toughest ethics committees they've ever gone through. You know, but and so I wear that proudly to know that we have good people on our ethics committee to make sure that our people get treated right. But I think there's a whole lot of other things as well, you know, when you're looking through ethics applications, you know, again, a lot of time they'll kind of, you know, maybe tokenly put people on, you know, RFPs or on proposals, but then you look at the back of the budget and they're there on like a, you know, 0.25 or something like that. So it's those sorts of things. So I think it is a wider discussion that we need to have collectively, you know, and I'm very happy for this sort of be the breeding ground, te kākano, for further discussions around that. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Hector. So one of the publications I did in 2020 was around Indigenous research ethics, and that was in 3 parts. The third part was stories of collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I really love those stories. I think they're really important stories. And each one of them, the non-Indigenous collaborators did so in ways that honoured you know, the context within which they're researching. And as an example, there's a young Pākehā student that I supervise for his doctorate. Now, so he's Pākehā, born in Hamilton, raised in Hamilton. He's doing his doctorate through Danish and Australian universities, and his topic is the use of taonga puoro as a healing modality. So straight away, you know, red flags go up. But this lovely young man, he spent the year before he started his doctorate talking to a whole lot of Māori, especially in non-Māori, and particularly in the Whanganui area, because that's where he was basing a lot of his work. You know, people like Cheryl Smith. And he wanted to know, oh, there's my friend. He wanted to know, you know, if what he was doing was right. And his project was transformed in the process of that year in something he called pre-ethics. And I think that's a really wonderful way. And a lot of our younger generation of researchers coming through, non-Indigenous ones, you know, are growing with the same kind of respect for culture, especially when they're working cross-culturally. So it is possible, more than possible. Yeah. But in the meantime, just say no. I know it's not easy.
Can I add one point though? Many of our young emerging Māori scholars don't have that privilege, and they're so desperate to build their academic career and publish that they're having to say yes to being the add-on brown face. And I mean, for those of us who have the privilege of being able to choose our research direction, that's taken 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
I worry, and that's why I really admire the notion of a Māori entity to be a kind of a waka that our emerging Māori scholars can attach to, at least in this area, Tamaki Makaurau, you know, to protect them from that.
Yes.
And to be the ones that stand up and say to those tauiwi, actually, no, go away.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Whaia Ella. A great pātai, and from what I think it's part of the responsibility of particularly a Māori ethics, Māori Research Ethics Committee like ours, to determine whether or not Māori involvement is sincere or disingenuous. We certainly spend a lot of time on those types of deliberations, something that we're aware of and cautious of. So I think part of the responsibility is on the researchers, but also on the assessors as well, to determine whether or not, hey, does this look right? Or they just pull them in, and being in a position to push back. And thank you for your inspired thoughts. I think there might be a vacancy coming up on the committee too. Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou hoki. E ne hua e mihoro rawa atu tō kōrero, e maha ngā whakaro i roto i taku roro. Engari, ko te mea nui ki au, ahakoa i me mai koe kia mātou, kāre anō koe hei mau te reo Māori. Kāre kore kai a koe te ngākau Māori, te wairua Māori, te whakaaro Māori, e ne maha ngā tauira e pāna ki tō mahi. E mahi rangahau, hei a te mutungo te rā, ko te katoa o tō mahi rangahau, ko te whāinga matua, hei hāpai te hauara o ngai tātou te iwi Māori. Nō reira, kia hau nei, tērā te mea nui. So, me mihi ake ki a koe e rawe tō kōrero. E pai ki te a koe anō, roa te wā.
Yes.
Ngari, before you go, I've got, I'm a bit unsure what to, given our next speaker, I'm unsure if this is a gift or a koha.
It's a koha.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later, but I really just wanted to thank you once again. Really great to see you. And ho mai anō te paki, kai kōrero te